In November of 1576, the strongest army in Spain did not march against a foreign enemy. It marched toward the richest city of its own empire. Antwerp was not a rebel fortress. It was not an enemy capital. It was the city whose merchants, bankers, credit, and trade helped keep the Spanish Empire alive. And in 3 days, that city was burned, looted, and broken by the very soldiers it had helped pay for. That was the disaster. Not only that soldiers sacked a city, but that an empire, unable to pay for its wars, allowed its finest army to devour the engine that funded those wars. Within a generation, Europe's economic center of gravity would begin to move north, away from Antwerp, toward Amsterdam. And one of the richest cities in the world would become a warning. An empire can be powerful enough to conquer continents, and still too broke to control its own soldiers. On the morning of November 4th, 1576, a column of men formed up in the fog outside Antwerp. They wore the faded colors of the Spanish tercios, the most feared infantry in Europe. They had marched from Naples, from Milan, from the burned villages of the Low Countries. They had broken French armies. They had crushed Protestant rebellions. They had bled for the largest empire the world had ever known. And now they were preparing to attack their own emperor's wealthiest city. Behind the walls, roughly 100,000 people waited. Merchants, bankers, weavers, peasants, refugee farmers. They knew the soldiers were Spanish. They knew Antwerp was Spanish. They knew, in theory, that the same flag flew over the city and over the men outside its gates. None of that mattered now. Inside the walls, half-built barricades blocked the main streets. They had been thrown up in haste by Walloon and German mercenaries, hired by the city's own civilian governor. Mercenaries hired to defend Antwerp from soldiers of the empire that owned it. At 11 o'clock, the trumpets sounded. By nightfall, the streets of the richest city in Europe were running with blood. By the third day, the new town hall, the proudest building in northern Europe, was a smoking shell. By the time it was over, the financial capital of the 16th century was gone. It is one of the strangest catastrophes in European history. The most professional army of the age sacked the city it was supposed to protect. The empire it served destroyed in 3 days of fire. The engine that paid for its wars, its fleets, and its global ambitions. Within a generation, the consequences would redraw the economic map of Europe. How did the most powerful military in the world end up devouring the heart of its own empire? To understand that, we have to go back. Before the trumpets, before the bankruptcy, before veterans with years of unpaid wages began to talk quietly among themselves in the camps, we have to go back to a city that, for one brief moment, looked like the center of the world. In the mid-16th century, Antwerp was something Europe had never really seen before. It was not the largest city in Europe. That was probably Istanbul or Paris. But Antwerp may have been the richest per square mile, perhaps even the richest per inhabitant. Standing on the Scheldt River, it became the place where the silver of Spanish America met the silks of Italy, the wool of England, the timber and grain of the Baltic, and the spices of Portuguese Asia. A Florentine merchant once wrote that he saw more wealth pass through Antwerp's bourse in one afternoon than through all of Florence in a year. He may have been exaggerating, but not by much. The city had perhaps 100,000 inhabitants. It had the first true commercial exchange in modern history. It had one of the largest concentrations of printing presses on the continent, turning out books and pamphlets in Latin, Dutch, French, English, and Spanish. It had a new town hall, finished only a decade earlier. with a facade so ambitious that visitors compared it to Roman architecture. In nearly every measurable sense, Antwerp was the financial brain of 16th century Europe, and it belonged to the King of Spain. That fact sounds absurd now. It sounded almost as absurd then. The Low Countries, what is today Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg, had come to the Spanish crown through inheritance, a Habsburg accident of marriage and death. The 17 provinces were Dutch and French-speaking. They were mercantile. They were increasingly Protestant, and they had been governed for centuries by their own laws and customs. Madrid was more than 1,000 miles away, yet in the 1560s, Philip II of Spain tried to rule them as he ruled Castile. Directly, religiously, without compromise. The result was rebellion. By 1576, the war that would later be called the 80 Years' War had been grinding on for 8 years. Protestant towns rose, were crushed, and rose again. Spanish armies marched north along the long supply road from Italy, the so-called Spanish Road, and garrisoned the major cities. The Duke of Alba, the empire's most feared general, had built a massive star-shaped citadel just outside Antwerp's walls. But that fortress was not mainly there to defend Antwerp from outside enemies. Its guns were turned inward. It was there to dominate the city itself. So Antwerp in 1576 was both the financial jewel of the Spanish Empire and a city living under occupation. The soldiers inside the citadel drew their wages, in theory, from letters of credit that flowed through the very bourse a few streets away. The system worked as long as money kept moving. By 1576, it was breaking. To understand what was about to happen, you have to understand the soldiers. The Spanish tercios were not a militia. They were not peasants called up for a season. They were the closest thing 16th century Europe had to a modern professional army. Long service infantry, hardened by decades of campaigning, organized into formations of pikemen, swordsmen, and musketeers. They had broken the French at Pavia. They had crushed Protestant princes in Germany. They had held Malta against the Ottomans. For roughly a century, no army in Europe wanted to meet them in open battle. But they were paid soldiers, not in the sense that they would fight for anyone. They were loyal to the Spanish crown. But their service was still a contract. They expected wages. They expected food. And when a campaign ended, they expected to be paid the arrears that had built up while they fought. That was the price of the empire's most valuable weapon. And the Spanish crown could no longer afford it. Philip II ruled the largest empire the world had ever seen. He ruled Spain, the Low Countries, southern Italy, the Philippines, most of South America, and parts of Africa and Asia. Silver poured into Seville from the mines of Potosi by the ton. By the standards of the age, he was the richest king on earth. But to his accountants, he was almost always broke. The reason was simple. He was fighting everywhere. He was fighting the Dutch Protestants. He was fighting the Ottomans in the Mediterranean. He was preparing for wars with the English and the French. He was funding inquisitions, fleets, missionaries, and fortifications across 2 oceans. The silver of America arrived in Seville, but much of it was already promised before it even landed. It had been borrowed against, pledged to bankers in Genoa and Augsburg, consumed by interest, war, and the next emergency. The empire ran on credit. The credit ran on the belief that more silver would always come, and the army of Flanders, stationed in the Low Countries, was at the end of a very long financial leash. By the mid-1570s, that leash was fraying. Some veteran units had not been paid in full for more than a year. Some had not been paid in any meaningful way for 2 years. By the time the catastrophe came, certain regiments were said to be owed back pay stretching 72 months. 6 years. Imagine that for a moment. You have been on campaign for 6 years. You have marched through countries whose languages you barely understand. You have watched friends die. You have enforced the authority of an empire that still expects obedience from you. And you have not been paid. Then you look north. Near you sits Antwerp, the wealthiest city in Europe. Its warehouses are full. Its exchange is busy. Its merchants are growing rich from the trade your pikes are supposed to protect. That was the kindling. It only needed a spark. The spark came on March 5th, 1576. Louis de Requesens, the Governor-General of the Low Countries, died suddenly in Brussels. He was not yet 50. Philip II had sent him to hold the territories together after the brutal failures of the Duke of Alba. For months, Requesens had been trying to negotiate, manage the army, and slow the financial bleeding. Now he was gone. The Spanish Empire's most important political position in Northern Europe was empty. There was no successor in place. There would not be one for months. Philip II, far away in Madrid, took his time. Letters between the Escorial and Brussels traveled at the speed of horses. A decision made in March might mean an order written in May and an arrival in July. In the meantime, the Council of State in Brussels tried to govern. It was a body of nobles, mostly Flemish, but it had no real authority over the Spanish army, and the army did not need speeches. It needed money. Without a governor-general to argue its case to Madrid, and without a strong figure to force silver out of the crown, the months of waiting turned darker. Soldiers began to gather in small groups. They began to talk. The veterans, the men with the longest arrears, began to elect what they called electos, representatives, captains chosen by the rank and file, not appointed by Madrid. It was not yet a mutiny in the modern sense. On paper, it was still the king's army. But the chain of command was being quietly rebuilt from below. Through the spring and summer of 1576, the situation worsened. Whole garrisons began to refuse orders. They stayed in their quarters. They demanded their wages. They sent formal letters demanding back pay, written almost like diplomatic documents. Some marched, still in formation and under their own elected officers, into smaller Flemish towns and lived there at the inhabitants' expense. The tercios had a chillingly polite word for this: a lodging, a place to stay until pay arrived. In Madrid, Philip's council weighed its options. The army needed to be paid. The bankers needed to be paid. The wars needed to continue. The mathematics did not work. The silver fleets had been late. The Genoese bankers were tightening their terms. The treasury was empty. On September 1st, 1576, Philip II did something no king of his stature had ever done quite so openly. He suspended payments on the crown's debt. The Spanish Empire, the wealthiest political entity on earth, formally declared what we would today call sovereign bankruptcy. The news traveled north along the Spanish road, through the Alpine passes, across the German plains, into the camps of the Army of Flanders, to the bankers of Genoa. It meant a financial crisis. To the courts of Europe, it meant a diplomatic earthquake. To the unpaid soldiers of the tercios, sitting in drafty quarters across the southern Low Countries, it meant something simpler. There is no money coming. Not late. Not next month. Not at all. And 60 miles to the north sat Antwerp, a city whose warehouses bulged with imported silver, velvet, spices, books, gold, weapons, and the wealth of a continent at the height of the Renaissance. A city behind walls built, in part, by Spanish engineers to keep its own population under control. The men of the tercios did not march on Antwerp yet. They did not have a full plan yet. But the conversation in the camps had changed. The army had stopped being only the empire's instrument. Slowly and quietly, it was becoming something the empire could no longer command. And by the time Madrid understood what that meant, Antwerp had already been marked. The news of the bankruptcy did not arrive in the camps as one clean announcement. It seeped in, a letter from Brussels, a merchant arriving from Antwerp with rumors, a messenger from another regiment confirming what everyone had already begun to suspect. Through September and into October of 1576, the regiments of the Army of Flanders came to a quiet, collective understanding. The crown had abandoned them. Now, when we picture an army hearing news like that, we usually imagine collapse. Men drinking, brawling, deserting in twos and threes. Officers losing control, companies dissolving into bandit gangs across the countryside. We imagine chaos, but that is not what happened. What happened in the Spanish camps that autumn was almost the opposite. The army did not dissolve. It reorganized. The men gathered, debated, and elected. In each regiment, the soldiers chose their own electos. These were representatives from the rank and file, often experienced veterans, with the kind of authority that comes only from years in the field. The electos formed councils. They issued orders. They organized supply. They arranged lodging. They even enforced discipline inside their own ranks. A man who looted outside the army's plan or harmed civilians without permission could be punished by his own comrades. The mutiny had rules. It had spokesmen. It had treasuries. It had demands written in formal language and sent to Brussels or Madrid as if they were diplomatic letters. That matters, because what happened next was not a drunken riot. It was a campaign. By mid-October, the mutinous regiments had begun to coordinate. Garrisons in nearby towns, Aalst, Lier, Breda, were communicating with the Spanish forces holding the Antwerp citadel. They knew what the others intended. They knew roughly when the assault might come. They were not rabble. They were the Empire's best soldiers, organized outside the official chain of command, and now pointed at a target. And by this point, the target was no longer a secret. There was no other obvious choice. Brussels was the political capital, but it did not have portable wealth on the scale the soldiers believed they were owed. Ghent and Bruges had been declining for decades. Amsterdam, in 1576, was still a modest fishing and trading town in rebellious Holland. Not yet the city it would become. Antwerp was different. Antwerp was the one place where 6 years of unpaid wages for thousands of armed men could plausibly be extracted in a matter of days. The same thing that made it the brain of the European economy made it that autumn the obvious prize for an army determined to pay itself. Inside Antwerp, people were beginning to understand this. On October 20th, 1576, an Antwerp merchant named Jan van de Meulen wrote to his brother. Van de Meulen was not a poor man. He belonged to the international commercial world of letters of credit, cargoes of cloth, and partnerships stretching from Spain to England to the Baltic. He was exactly the kind of man Antwerp had been built to serve. And on that day, he wrote that he had been stopped outside the city by Spanish soldiers, mutineers on the road, demanding goods and silver. It is a small detail, almost ordinary, but it tells you what the air felt like in those weeks. The Spanish army had stopped protecting international trade. It had become something international trade had to avoid. A merchant going about his business, now expected to be robbed by his own emperor's men. 2 days later, on October 22nd, an Englishman named George Gascoigne arrived in Antwerp. Gascoigne was a soldier and a poet, one of those 16th century figures who seemed equally at home with a pike and a pen. He was passing through on business that has never been entirely clear. He took a room in the city. He had no idea he had just walked into one of the most infamous massacres of his century. By the end of October, the people of Antwerp could see the shape of what was coming. Refugees were arriving from villages closer to the camps. Rumors spread of mutineers gathering in Aalst. The Spanish forces in the great star-shaped citadel outside the walls had not moved openly yet, but they had stopped pretending to obey civilian authority. Provisions were going in. Messages were going out. The garrison was preparing. This brings us to the man whose role in the catastrophe is still debated. Sancho Davila. He was the castellan of the citadel, the senior Spanish military commander on Antwerp's doorstep. In theory, he was a loyal officer. He had not openly joined the mutiny. His soldiers were no better paid than the others, but his command still existed on paper, by title and by duty. He was the man responsible for stopping the citadel garrison from doing exactly what it was about to do. The comfortable version, told later to protect Spanish officers, was that Davila tried to restrain his men, that he was overwhelmed, that the mutiny rolled over him as it rolled over the city, that he was, in some way, another victim of events. That version is almost certainly not true. What Davila actually did, in the last week of October and the first days of November, was begin to align his own forces with the mutineers outside. He shared information. He coordinated movements. When the mutinous regiments from Aalst and the surrounding garrisons marched toward Antwerp, they did not have to fight their way to the citadel. They were welcomed. The citadel garrison and the outside mutineers merged into a single operational force. Historians still argue about why. Some have seen Davila as a cynical opportunist, a man who used the mutiny to extract his own arrears and claim his own share. Others have been more cautious. He may have believed he was doing the only practical thing. The civilian government was bringing foreign mercenaries into Antwerp to defend the city against him. From his point of view, the safety of his Spanish troops may have required striking first. But whether he was an instigator or an accomplice, the result was the same. The commander of the citadel did not stop the mutiny. He helped direct it. And inside Antwerp, the civilian government had its own disastrous decision to make. The acting governor of Antwerp was Frédéric Perrenot, the Seigneur de Champagne. He was a Burgundian nobleman and a loyal subject of the Spanish crown. But by 1576, he was terrified of his own emperor's soldiers. He could see the citadel preparing. He could read the same letters and rumors that every Antwerp merchant could read. He knew the tercios were coming. He needed troops to defend the city. But he could not call on the Spanish army, because the Spanish army was the threat. So he turned to the only option left in the southern Low Countries that autumn. He hired mercenaries, Walloons from the French-speaking south, German Landsknechts from across the Rhine, soldiers of fortune, available for cash, loyal to whoever had signed their contract that week. In hindsight, this decision helped seal Antwerp's fate. Two things happened at once. First, the Spanish soldiers in and around the city watched foreign troops pouring into the streets. To Champagne, this was defense. To the mutineers, it looked like betrayal. The civilians whose wealth they saw as their unpaid wages were now hiring outsiders to keep them out. That gave the mutiny a grievance, a justification. Second, the mercenaries Champagne hired were not truly an army. They had been raised quickly, paid only partially, given little time to train together, placed under officers they barely knew. They were not the veterans of Pavia and Lepanto. Against the tercios, they were unlikely to hold. Still, Champagne did what he could. Through late October and into the first days of November, he ordered barricades built across Antwerp's main streets. Earthworks were dug in the squares. Cannons were rolled into position. Civilians, including the city's armed merchant guilds, were drawn into the defense. By the morning of November 3rd, Antwerp had something that looked like a plan. Not a strong one, but something. Then the panic broke. Peasants from the villages around Antwerp had been hearing the same rumors as everyone else. They had seen Spanish columns gathering in the countryside. They had heard from refugees who had escaped towns the mutineers had already passed through. So on November 3rd, they began to pour into the city. They came with cattle. They came with carts. They came with furniture, blankets, food, and children. They came because the walls of Antwerp, however thinly defended, looked safer than open country with unpaid tercios moving through it. The image survives only in fragments. Andries van der Meulen, Jan's brother, wrote that the cries and lamentations of the people were so loud that one's heart grieved to hear them. The busiest commercial streets in northern Europe filled with frightened farmers and lowing livestock. The wealthy boarded up their houses. Merchants tried frantically and probably too late to hide whatever could still be hidden. Bills of exchange, jewels, account books, portable wealth that might survive if the city did not. Outside the walls, the convergence was almost complete. Through the night of November 3rd and the early hours of November 4th, the mutinous regiments from Aalst, Lier, Breda, and other garrisons closed on Antwerp. They had been marching for days. They moved in formed columns, under elected officers. They were not drunk. They were not scattered. In the weeks before this, they had held councils about how to assault a city, which targets to hit first, how to divide the streets, how to manage the plunder so every man received what his back pay was supposed to deliver. Sometime before dawn on November 4th, the outside columns reached the citadel and joined Sancho Davila's forces. The combined force numbered somewhere between 5,000 and 6,000 men. They had little heavy artillery. There had been no time for a proper siege, but they did not believe they would need one. They were the tercios. The barricades in front of them had been built in a week by men who had never fought together. The mercenaries inside had no deep reason to die for a nobleman who had hired them only days before. Inside Antwerp, the defenders waited at their posts. Champagne made his rounds, trying to appear calm. The merchant guilds checked their weapons. The Walloon and German troops watched the barricades. Jan van der Meulen, in his house, may have been writing one of the last letters of his life. George Gascoigne, the English poet who had arrived 2 weeks earlier, was now trapped in a city about to become a slaughterhouse. The fog over the Scheldt was thick that morning. The November air was cold. Outside the walls, the elettos gave the order. Companies fell into formation. Officers checked their lines. The columns moved into attack positions. At 11 o'clock, the trumpet sounded. The barricades did not last 20 minutes. The Spanish columns came forward at speed. They did not use a slow, careful advance. No probing, no patient reduction of obstacles. They attacked everything at once. Pikes lowered, muskets fired, swords drawn. The veterans of the tercios had spent decades doing this against better troops than the ones now standing in front of them. The Walloon and German mercenaries held for a few minutes, long enough, in some accounts, for the men in the front ranks to die. Then they broke. They threw down their pikes. They ran. They abandoned the earthworks. the cannons, and the streets they had been paid to defend. Some vanished into side alleys, trying to blend into the civilian crowd. Others ran for the gates on the far side of the city, hoping to escape north. Many were hunted down. By mid-afternoon, the defense Champagne had spent weeks assembling had effectively ceased to exist. This is where the sack of Antwerp changed into something else. Until that point, it was still technically a battle, a military assault against armed defenders. But once the barricades fell, the Spanish soldiers did not stop. They moved through the city in organized companies, street by street, house by house. The famous Antwerp merchant houses were entered one by one. Narrow, deep, richly carved Renaissance buildings, filled with the wealth of a generation of trade. The men coming through the doors were not amateur looters. They had spent 6 years thinking about what they were owed. They had spent weeks planning how to extract it. Over the next 3 days, they settled the mathematics of arrears with fire, steel, and torture. Merchants were forced to reveal hidden valuables, strongboxes, buried silver, cashed letters of credit. Houses that resisted were burned. Houses that obeyed were stripped, room by room. Witnesses found the patience of it almost as terrifying as the violence. The killing was widespread. Men were cut down in the streets, in their houses, on the steps of churches, bodies piled where they fell. The mutineers seem to have tried, at least within their own code, to organize the plunder and distribute it. But for the civilians inside Antwerp, that distinction meant almost nothing. No one escaped untouched. In the early afternoon of November 4th, the new town hall caught fire. Whether it was deliberately set, or whether flames spread from nearby buildings during the assault on the central square, is still debated. The result is not the proudest building in Antwerp, burned through the afternoon and into the night. It had been finished only 12 years earlier. It was the symbol of the city's mercantile confidence. And with it burned the municipal records of Antwerp. Deeds, contracts, council minutes, tax registers. The documentary memory of a city. The flames were visible for miles. Later engravings would show the scene again and again across northern Europe. Antwerp burning. The town hall at the center. For the 16th century, it was like the image of a modern financial tower falling. Jan van der Meulen died sometime during those 3 days. According to letters from surviving relatives, he tried to escape the city. He attempted to climb over the walls and reach the open country. He did not make it. He left behind his correspondence with his brother Andries. Hundreds of letters, now preserved, ending in the middle of a life. The merchant who had been stopped by mutineers on the road 2 weeks earlier never came home. By November 7th, the sack had run its course. The mutineers had what they had come for. The city was gutted in every meaningful economic sense. Bodies lay in the streets. The harbor was nearly empty. Many ships that could leave had already left, carrying whatever merchants had managed to load before the assault. Champagne survived. So did George Gascoigne, the English poet, who would later write that he had seen Antwerp sacked and the blood of its poor inhabitants spilled in the streets. How many people died has been argued for 4 centuries. Contemporary estimates range from around 7,000 to as high as 18,000. Modern scholars usually treat the lower figure, roughly 7,000, as the most defensible estimate. The higher numbers came from Protestant pamphlets, printed across northern Europe after the sack. Those pamphlets were not written only to record history. They were written to mobilize hatred against Spain. But here is the difficulty. Nobody really knows. The city records that might have allowed a careful count burned in the town hall fire. The Spanish military had no reason to count its victims. The survivors wrote under conditions where grief and rumor made precision impossible. Somewhere between 7,000 and 18,000 people died in Antwerp in 3 days. The truth was probably closer to the lower end. But the higher number stuck in Europe's imagination, and that would matter almost as much as the bodies themselves. While Antwerp burned, Spain finally had a governor-general again. His name was Don Juan of Austria. He was the illegitimate half-brother of Philip II, 5 years earlier. He had won fame as the victor of the naval battle of Lepanto. He was one of the most celebrated military figures in Europe. Philip had appointed him to replace Requesens, and he arrived in Luxembourg, on the southern edge of the Low Countries, just as the sack was unfolding. There was nothing he could do. He had no troops he could command. His troops were inside Antwerp, taking what they believed was theirs. He had no money to offer. He had no political weight yet in a region that had stopped trusting Madrid. So Don Juan sat in Luxembourg and received reports that grew more horrifying by the hour. The Spanish Empire had built its global system on one belief, that its army could project the king's will anywhere. But in November of 1576, the king's new commander arrived just in time to learn that the army had developed a will of its own. And when the killing stopped, the damage did not stay inside Antwerp's walls. It began to travel. The sack of Antwerp ended on November 7th. But what happened next changed the political geography of Europe. For a generation, the 17 provinces of the Low Countries had been divided, Catholic and Protestant, French-speaking and Dutch-speaking, loyalist and rebellious, until 1576. The Dutch Revolt had mostly been a Protestant uprising in the north. The Catholic southern provinces, including Brabant and Flanders, had largely remained under Spanish control. Spain's strategy was simple: use southern Catholic loyalty to isolate northern Protestant rebellion. Antwerp shattered that strategy in 3 days, because Antwerp was not a Protestant rebel city. It was Catholic. It was loyal. It was administered under Spanish rule, and it had just been burned by Spanish troops. The horror of what happened did something years of Protestant pamphlets had failed to do. It convinced the southern provinces that Spanish military power was not protection. It was a threat. It proved that loyalty to Madrid could not save a city from Madrid's own army. Within days, the smoke from Antwerp became politics. On November 8, 1576, delegates from across the Low Countries gathered in Ghent. Catholic and Protestant provinces, which had every reason to distrust each other, now had one shared fear: the unpaid, uncontrollable Spanish army. The agreement they signed became known as the Pacification of Ghent. It did not create peace forever. It did not erase religious hatred. It did not make the 17 provinces one people. But for a brief moment, shared terror did what shared faith could not. It united them against the Spanish military presence on their soil. The unity would not last. Within a few years, the southern provinces would be pulled back toward Spain. The northern provinces would keep fighting. Decades later, they would become the independent Dutch Republic. But the moment when Catholic and Protestant provinces stood together began while Antwerp was still smoking. And as the politicians moved, the printing presses moved even faster. Within weeks of the sack, pamphlets describing the horror were circulating through northern Europe. They appeared in Dutch, French, English, and German. Some were eyewitness accounts. Some were copied from earlier reports. Some were sharpened for politics. All of them carried the same image: Spanish soldiers, a loyal city, fire, blood, bodies in the streets. The sack became more than a military disaster. It became a story Europe could repeat. Pamphlets described innocent civilians being violated and murdered. They described churches, houses, and the town hall burning. They named the citadel. They named Sancho de Avila. They turned Antwerp into proof that Spanish power was not order, but tyranny. For the Dutch revolt, that mattered enormously. A rebellion needs more than armies. It needs a story people can believe. After Antwerp, the rebels had won. George Gascoigne, the English soldier and poet trapped inside the city, wrote his own account. It was published in London in 1576 under the title The Spoyle of Antwerp. For English readers, it became one of the most important descriptions of the massacre. A man who had been there, an English voice, a witness describing Spanish cruelty in direct, vivid language. For generations, it helped shape how English Protestants imagined Spain, not merely as a rival, but as a cruel Catholic empire threatening European liberty. There is, however, a complication. Gascoigne probably did not write most of what appeared in his own pamphlet. Modern scholars, comparing his English text with Dutch pamphlets from the same months, have found passages that are too close to be coincidence. Gascoigne translated, rearranged, added a few first-person details, but much of the text was likely drawn from Dutch accounts already in circulation. That does not mean the horror was invented. The deaths were real. The fire was real. The sack was real. But the most famous English account was not pure testimony. It was already propaganda, shaped, polished, and aimed at an audience ready to believe the worst about Spain. And that is why Antwerp mattered far beyond Antwerp. The sack fed what would later be called the Black Legend, a long-lasting image of Spain as an empire of unusual cruelty, often based on real violence, often exaggerated, always politically useful. The Black Legend would shape Protestant Europe's view of Spanish power for centuries. It would help justify Dutch resistance, English wars, and anti-Spanish alliances. It would survive in books, sermons, histories, and schoolrooms, long after the bodies in Antwerp had disappeared. In that sense, Antwerp was not only a massacre, it was a reputation crisis before the modern world had a word for it. An event carried by print so powerfully that the story outran the facts. The economic consequences lasted even longer. Antwerp was rebuilt. The town hall rose again. Merchants returned. Trade did not vanish overnight, but something more important than buildings had been destroyed. Trust. Antwerp had been the place where international capital felt safe, where merchants believed contracts would be honored, where letters of credit could move across borders because the city itself seemed stable. After November 1576, that belief was broken. If the richest city in the Spanish Netherlands could be looted by Spanish troops, then wealth was not safe there. If the empire's own soldiers could burn the financial center that helped fund them, then Antwerp was no longer the secure heart of European trade. Money began to look north. So did printers, bankers, diamond traders, shipping families. Commercial networks that had made Antwerp great began to migrate, slowly but decisively, toward Amsterdam. In 1576, Amsterdam was still not the giant it would become. It was smaller, less glamorous, less central. But it had something Antwerp had lost, a future that looked safer. Over the next generation, Amsterdam rose. A modest Dutch trading town became the new financial capital of Europe. The 17th century, the Dutch Golden Age, was being seeded by what happened in Antwerp's streets over 3 November days. The empire that sacked Antwerp did not gain what it thought it had gained. The tercios extracted plunder. They took silver. They stripped warehouses. They paid themselves, for a moment, with stolen wealth. But Spain's wars did not end. The debts did not disappear. the bankruptcies continued. Philip II would default again and again across the rest of his reign. The northern provinces would harden into a hostile Protestant republic. The Spanish road would keep dragging soldiers north for decades at staggering cost. By the time the 80 Years' War ended in 1648, the Dutch Republic was independent. Amsterdam had become one of the great financial centers of the world. And the Spanish Empire, though still vast, was no longer the confident machine it had seemed to be when its veterans formed up in the fog outside Antwerp. There is a phrase historians sometimes use for disasters like this: a parasite that kills its host. The Spanish Empire had built a military instrument so powerful that Europe feared it. But that instrument was expensive, too expensive to pay reliably. And when the empire could not feed it, the army fed itself. It turned on the richest city within reach. The result was not simply a sack. It was a system biting into its own body. There is no single madman at the center of this story. No one person explains everything. The tercios who attacked Antwerp were not a disorganized mob. They were rational, disciplined, angry professionals trapped inside a broken financial system. Sancho d'Avila did not create the crisis alone. Champagne did not doom the city alone. Philip II did not personally order Antwerp to burn. The catastrophe came from something colder, an empire that wanted more than it could pay for, a treasury stretched across oceans, a war machine that had become too valuable to disband and too expensive to maintain, a bureaucracy too slow to move money across the distances of a 16th century empire, and soldiers who waited until waiting no longer made sense. That is what makes the sack of Antwerp so strange. It was not a story of foreign enemies overwhelming a city. It was a story of an empire being eaten by the apparatus built to protect it. Think back to that morning, the fog over the Scheldt, the faded colors of the Spanish tercios outside the walls, the merchants behind the gates, looking out at the soldiers of their own king. The barricades held by men hired only days before because the city could no longer trust the army that was supposed to defend it. At 11 o'clock, the trumpets sounded. For a few hours, the most powerful military system in Europe and the most sophisticated commercial system in Europe stood across the barricades from each other. They had been built by the same empire, paid by the same treasury, ruled by the same king. But the empire that built them both could no longer afford to keep them on the same side. When the barricades fell, Antwerp was the visible casualty. But something larger fell with it. The belief that force and wealth could live forever in the same imperial house without one turning on the other. In November of 1576, that belief burned with the town hall. And even at the height of its power, the Spanish Empire never fully recovered from the fire.